Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I am Andrea and I manage customer experience here at ProdPad. And with us as part of our webinar series is Chris Massey, product manager at Mind the Product, who is going to be talking to us about gamification and product. Super exciting topic. Now, as usual, what we'll do is Chris will go through the presentation, and at the end we will have a quick Q&A session. So if you have any questions, you can drop it on the webinar Zoom chat panel or on the Q&A tab. With that said, Chris, on to you.
Hello. So you're actually getting a 2-for-1 today because when Andrea and I first talked about this, we started talking about gamification because I am very passionate about it by dint of being a massive nerd. But we actually started talking about how I've actually applied that in a few concrete examples. So I'm gonna go through both of those. I know this was initially pitched as something about hooked, and I'll get to that in a second. So the underlying drive for this was basically I've done a bunch of reading about games and game design, and I see a lot of people talking about gamification, and from where I stand, a lot of people get it wrong. And I'm going to kind of explain a bit more what I mean by that. So the real thing here is, okay, so what should we be doing about games? So let me just get this working, and hopefully it works. So a little context, first of all. As I said, this is not actually anything to do with Hooked. If you've heard of this excellent book by Nir Eyal, it is absolutely worth a read. If you haven't, it's absolutely worth a read. If you have read it and we're coming here expecting more of that, that is just a heads up, not what we're going to be talking about per se. Although there's common elements in the kind of gamification stuff that I talk about and the stuff that Nir talks about. This is, as I said, rooted in this frustration that I've had for a long time, that people keep talking about gamification and they mean something, but they don't necessarily know what it means or what it should mean. And that's kind of what I'm going to hopefully bring across today, kind of what it should mean for product people, from a product perspective. So what it typically means is someone comes along and says, I've got this product that's kind of functional, does a job, it's not terribly exciting. I want to make it faster, better, more engaging, whatever. So I'm going to jazz it up a little bit. Let's like turbo power this thing. And if you're very, very lucky, you might get a turbo powered thing, whatever that is. You're much more likely to end in fiery death because the key thing here to bear in mind is that games are, well, there's a typo in that. Games are not just bundles of mechanics and artwork. There is this kind of weird perception that you can take a game and kind of decompose it into, like, okay, I'm going to put some points on it, and then I'm going to put some badges and a leaderboard and some cute artwork, and ta-da, game. And that's not really what games are. They're just products. They're just software products, and you wouldn't treat any other software product like that, kind of gluing on features in the hope that somehow that will magically improve your product. If it has to be aligned with your vision, your product strategy, and these kinds of things. So I think games are sort of weapons grade engagement motivators. They are products which are built for one end, and that is kind of to not actually to hold people in the game. People seem to think that a game is designed to hold your attention as long as possible. And some games are, but some games are also designed to tell a story. They're a narrative, and kind of that comes up when you're designing games. You are thinking about the narrative you're trying to tell, the kind of the experience you're trying to create. And so you can't just graft that into a product. So the idea here, if we want to get down to it, games are supposed to be fun, and we can broadly agree on that. So, okay, we want to make our products fun. So how do you fun? How do you kind of make your product something that people want to use? As anyone has probably heard, if you're going to play a multiplayer game on your console or anything, you're mostly going to get shouted at and shot at by 14-year-olds with fast twitch reflexes. It turns out that's not actually that fun. I can confirm this.
I too can confirm this, just so you know.
Yes, lots of research suggests that we don't play games because we enjoy being shot in the virtual face again and again by 14-year-olds. Who knew? More helpfully, these guys, Scott Rigby and Richard Ryan, they're game designers, researchers, and authors, and they have this model of fun. Fun is an experience where you can gain competence, you can have autonomy, and the thing you are doing is what they call relatedness. And sort of in practical terms, that is both the thing that you are doing is related to some effect that you're trying to achieve, but it's something that you can in some way relate to. It's, there's a sense of these things kind of come all together. Now, this is not the first time when I saw this, this was a definite epiphany moment for me when I was kind of looking at sort of researching this, because actually there's another model that looks very similar to this. Mastery, autonomy, and purpose, which is almost rephrasing the same thing. It's a different flavor, and that comes from Dan Pink and this excellent book Drive, which is it's a good plain paperback. I definitely recommend it. It's a nice read. The thing to bear in mind here is that these mastery, autonomy, and purpose are things that motivate us no matter what we're doing, whether we're playing a game, whether we're doing work. These are sort of universal forces. Games just happen to tap into that directly in a way that, say, Microsoft Word doesn't, generally speaking. If you want to hear someone actually say some really smart things about this, and about like how these forces drive users of software products, I highly recommend anything by Kathy Sierra. There's links there at the bottom. They'll come out in the slides that we share after this next week. But Kathy has done numerous talks, a few at Mind the Product, a few at Business of Software, and many elsewhere. And she's released this book, which is very usefully short. And her point is, linked along that is in that same vein, that you don't make products to build a great product. You make a product to make a great user. And so that's kind of where we're going with this game design kind of topic. And effectively, what humans want to enjoy is this so-called flow state. I think we can all talk about a time when we were doing something that was, required, a lot of skill, but it wasn't very exciting, and it was deeply, deeply boring, or that was, highly charged but didn't require much from you to do, and that was a high anxiety. Like, this isn't necessarily rocket science to describe, but it is a tricky thing to engineer. And this is why game design is such why it's a singular craft, why it's something that actually people can spend their lives trying to achieve, is trying to keep people in this magic flow state where they are feeling just the right balance for them of skill and challenge. So this is kind of how you fun. But obviously, how do you apply that to product? It's not necessarily obvious. So we've got this idea of flow, and flow might be an idea of engagement, which is another great buzzword that you hear a lot, particularly on sort of my software history is all web-based products. So you get a lot of people say, oh, what's the engagement of this content or the engagement of the feature? And the thing is, like, there is no one true engagement metric. I had a lot of fun designing this terrible pun, by the way, and I'm not going to apologize. To give you a really blunt analogy, like what counts as good engagement, I'm making air quotes, for accounting software is not what makes good engagement for ticket buying software, obviously. Any kind of engagement metric is only valuable if it serves your customers' goals, gets them using your product and getting value from the product, and ultimately puts money in your bank. So the answer of what does engagement look like from a user's perspective, and what does engagement look like for you as a product person, is quite honestly, unsurprisingly, it depends. I just grabbed the R metrics, the pirate metrics here, because they're kind of useful. If people go through this flow, that implies they're getting the value, but up to a point, it's a conversation. Like, I'm not gonna I'm not here to tell you what engagement looks like, what necessarily fun looks like. And I'm going to get to the point momentarily. So the thing I'm trying to get to here is that you don't just rip apart a game, take a bunch of features out of it, and put it into your product any more than you would do that for any other product. Like maybe you see a nice UI interaction that's kind of cool, and that maybe you decide you want to try and use that, but you're going to talk to your designer, and your designer's hopefully going to tell you whether or not that fits with your design language or your UI framework. There's a whole bunch of things like that, and that's true of borrowing ideas from games as it is from any other product. So the main thing I want to get down to is that if you want to gamify your product, if you want to make your product more engaging, more sticky, more effective, more fun, although accounting software being fun is a bit of a stretch, but if you want to give it a go, the key is to think like a game designer, to think like someone who is trying to convey something with a product, to communicate something with a product, and to keep people in a flow state. So points, badges, and leaderboards might do it, but you don't know. You've got to tune it. You've got to understand what are the things you're trying to achieve and go from there. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to step through 4 different dynamics that you can think about when you're considering your product. That I'm going to give you some examples from how these are manifested in game design, and then give you some concrete examples of what that looks like in product design or feature set. And then we'll kind of hopefully wrap that up so you kind of see what I mean when I say it's not about the features per se, it's about the thought process and the mentality. So first and foremost is, arguably, is this idea of balancing depth and complexity. So these are two, these kind of are slightly orthogonal axes when you're thinking about your game design. You can have a game that is very deep and not very complex, or a game that is very complex and not very deep. Let me give you an example. So something like Go has a relatively low complexity threshold. Like the rules are very, very simple. Like how you play Go, how you play checkers, how you play chess is, broadly speaking, very, very simple rule set. But the depth of gameplay is huge. It's got huge replayability. You can, easy to learn, hard to master is that kind of low complexity, high depth environment. And then on the other side, it has, I don't know where that came from exactly, but it's basically every flight simulator ever. And for people who are first learning to drive a car, particularly if it's stick shift, about the same kind of experience, I imagine. It's that experience where you have to assimilate a huge amount of information to figure out just to make small progress in the game. Now, there is some benefit, like there's some sense of satisfaction in that mastery. And for some users, that mastery is really critical. And I'll show you an example in a moment, and very satisfying. And indeed, they actually derive value from that mastery, but it's not for everyone. So you just need to figure out for your given product, for your given users, which do they need? Do they need a high degree of complexity and fine control, or do they need something that is relatively, has low complexity, but also of depth? Practical example, photo editing. One of these 2 photos I did in Photoshop. It was basically, it was a snapshot at a I think it was a conference actually. And then I tweaked it and I played with it and I kind of tried to get it exactly right. And it took me about 10 to 15 minutes of Photoshopping just to kind of like get just that right blur and just that right, color tint. Now, I should point out, I'm not a Photoshop master by any measure, but the other one I did on my iPad and it took me about 1 to 2 minutes. The end result is arguably the same, but the question is, obviously one arguably has more intent behind it. It was more carefully designed, but the Photoshop example is a great one because, photographers and visual artists actually, the complexity of Photoshop and the power of Photoshop is a huge value to them. To take the accounting software example, like, your actual accountant probably has a much different version of accounting software that gives them huge amount of control and huge amount of there's a huge amount of complexity that you don't need to know about as a casual user. So depending on what you're designing for and who you're designing for, actually balancing the depth and complexity to the right level for your users will have a much greater impact than giving them points, for example. If you want a good way to think about this, like a good useful yardstick, it's how many kind of mental calculations per second are you asking your users to make to see value. So if it's Photoshop, they're finding the menu, they're digging in the menu, they're figuring out what the hell does do before they see any value. If it's, you know, a reasonably straightforward iPad app, they're just kind of loading it and probably just tapping it slightly blindly until they get the result they want. But facetiousness aside, they have to make very few decisions to get value. Now, related to that is this idea of onboarding. Games are often absolute masterclasses at onboarding and getting you doing relatively complex things relatively quickly and actually enjoying the experience. So this is particularly relevant, obviously, when it comes down to depth and complexity. Obviously, depending on how you tune your depth complexity curve, your onboarding experience needs to change. So let's take a look at sort of the masterclass in onboarding, arguably, is the original Super Mario Bros. There is no manual for Super Mario. There is no tutorial. There is nothing that pops up on the screen that says, now do a thing to jump. You just play the first level. And that first level is tuned, I'm not kidding you, down to the pixel to give you exactly the right environment to learn how to play, learn the basics of how to play Super Mario. And more to the point, you don't even realize you're being onboarded. You're just playing the first level. Now, obviously, that's that difficulty curve as a way to onboard people is something that's common across many games. But as soon as the games start to get a bit more complicated, so take your average PlayStation, your average Xbox controller, which has, let me think, there's the D-pad, so that's 4 plus 2 bumpers, that's 6. You're talking at least 10 buttons. Oh, no, make it 12 because the actual analog sticks can depress as well, plus all the directions. So the complexity opportunity is huge. So often they need to really walk you through and actually tell you what to do. Now, neither of these approaches is better or worse. They're just different approaches that are necessary depending on the needs of the game. So obviously products have different ways of doing it. And I'm seeing more and more on web-based products, examples of kind of that, this kind of tutorial. For, you know, when you first fire up the product, there's a couple of pop-ups that say, you know, try this out, click here to do that thing, that kind of guided tour of the product. Now, the really interesting thing about games, if you want to talk about gamifying your product, is that that tutorial is delivering value to you. The first time you play Mario, that first level, you're getting the value of playing Mario, the fun, the interesting, like, how do I, you know, that sense of mastery. You're not doing a tutorial. The value is inherent in the onboarding. And that's an interesting thing. I don't think anyone in software has necessarily cracked that quite effectively yet. At least, you know, not consistently, but that idea of like your onboarding is actually delivering value to you. So that's an interesting idea to play with if you want to think about how to gamify. Now, in practical terms, a couple of examples I picked up way back when, you know, Facebook's onboarding is arguably never ending. They are constantly trying to encourage you to tell them stuff so that they can supposedly add value by recommending relevant stuff, connecting with relevant people. They've chosen to kind of have a very simple onboarding process where you basically give them a name and an email address and ta-da, you're in. And then you start actually, you know, deriving value on an ongoing basis. So their onboarding process is effectively never ending. Twitter does a slightly similar thing where you first join and the first thing they do is get you to follow a bunch of people. Microsoft Office made an interesting pivot. If you want to talk about sort of onboarding, where they used to have just menus upon menus upon menus. It was menus all the way down. And then they released the ribbon. As with all these things, some people love it, some people hate it. But the point was they're giving you really good visual representations of what you can achieve and just a slimmed down version of the feature set to help you start to build value before you think, actually, I need more of this, and you dive down. So those are really kind of, you know, not fairly quote unquote boring product examples of how onboarding can be applied, like the different kind of ideas of thinking about onboarding can be applied. And Google obviously has a very simple situation. That's a bit like, Google's a bit like the Mario Bros of product onboarding, where you just use it. You just there's only one thing to do, so you do that thing and hopefully you see some value. And that's right up there with how that first level of Super Mario works. The really interesting thing that people don't necessarily pay as much attention to in games, but I think is really powerful, is this idea of aesthetics and how do you communicate to your users intent and whether or not this is for them using aesthetics and features. So again, let's take a look at a game example. I'm going to assume nothing about who's familiar with what, but the game on the left is I think it's Battlefield, which is a first-person shooter set. This particular one, I think, is set mostly in the present day. This particular scene is somewhere in the Middle East. But look at the color palette. It's very stark. It's very subdued. It's desaturated. The game on the right is Halo, where you play literally a genetically enhanced, cybernetically enhanced super soldier in space with assorted, crazy, absolutely mad space weaponry and toys. The color palette's highly vibrant. The gameplay feels very different. Now, that's the aesthetics. Let's talk about the features. In Battlefield, the lovely, delightfully stark, grim DC universe first-person shooter on the left, you are incredibly vulnerable. They want you to play the game in a certain way, and you can take very, very few shots before you die. Surprisingly true to life, as it happens. But the whole thing about it is designed to make you feel vulnerable, make you feel, frankly, quite vicious, actually, because you've got to be super, super sneaky to play that game well, or you've got to be absolutely ruthless. It's designed to make you feel and play a certain way with the aesthetics and the way that the features balance out. On the right-hand side with Halo, it's very bright, it's very sci-fi. You are a super soldier. You can take a ridiculous amount of punishment before you even really slow down, which encourages people to play a certain way. It encourages a certain kind of cavalier willingness to run and jump in. You're embodying a character who is powerful, and so they create things that let you feel powerful. So this is a kind of a really good example of two games in arguably the same space, first-person shooters, both basically war simulators, where your feature set and your aesthetics communicate very, very different things. So to talk about some actual users, actual products in the business world, this is Microsoft Visual Studio, circa 2014, I think. So I don't know, a recent screenshot. Again, looking at depth and complexity. We're talking about gamifying this. If we talk about the game design principles and you apply to this, they've obviously gone for an expert user here because you've got a high degree of complexity and the entire aesthetic is designed to make what you can do with this. If you want to take another software IDE, let's take a look at Scratch, which is designed for kids. The entire UI, the entire scope of what you can do, the way they present information is radically different because it's designed to give kids a feeling that this is for them and this is a tool that they can master and they can wrap their heads around. Different audiences, different ways that it's expecting you to work. Notice things like the plug and play components that is, again, designed to help you to just slot things together and get value quickly. The entire experience is different because this has been built like a game. If you want to get a sense of what aesthetics can affect about people's reaction to your products right up front, look at wireframes. The more sketchy a wireframe feels, you're going to have a very different conversation with the user if they look at something and it looks like you just sketched on the back of a napkin. They're going to give you a very different perspective about what it could be, what it should maybe do, and what the possibilities and their problems are, than if you showed them something highly polished and here's my super finished, my super polished finished product. They're going to critique, well, I don't like that shade of blue, which isn't actually that helpful. So, well, depending on what you're trying to test. So the aesthetics of what you give to people are actually going to change their behavior. And in game design terms, that's really, really powerful. Now, this is kind of where people tend to gravitate towards when they think about gamification. They think about motivation. They think about, I want people to stick around, be super engaged, and really, really kind of use my product and love using my product. And everything I've talked about beforehand is actually also part of how you create an engaging product and quote unquote gamified by thinking like a game designer. But this is where people tend to sort of zero in on first. So let's talk a little bit about the distinction between these two things. So people basically do everything for love or money, rarely both. They don't necessarily, and I'm sure you've probably all heard this mantra before, that no one actually cares about your product. They care about the thing they're trying to do. And their motivation is not that I desperately have to use this particular app. It's I'm trying to get something done. And that something might be, and what we might call an intrinsic motivation. So they're doing it because it's something that is valuable to them. So let's take something like Instagram. People, a casual user of Instagram is posting photos because they want to project a certain image to people. They want to share photos with their family or their friends. Alternatively, you get the, for example, the lifestyle influencer on Instagram who is using Instagram because they're trying to make money. So their motivations are very, very different. And their motivation is extrinsic to using Instagram. If Instagram goes away, they will find another route to doing that because their goal is external to the Instagram experience or to the value of sharing photos per se. Now, what's really critical about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and this is something I think a lot of people fall prey to because they're not aware of it, is this thing called replacement. If you give people, if you find someone who is doing something for intrinsic reasons, so let's say the example is someone who loves to play the piano, and they do it because they love it. They love the experience, they love how it makes them feel, they love the mastering, they're playing piano. And if for whatever reason they start to become a competition pianist, they go and they effectively do the thing they love, but now do it for money. And they start off as like a small performer, small town performer, and they scale and they reach a plateau where suddenly they can't earn more from doing the thing that this thing that they loved, or let's say for whatever reason they if it was for some reason they actually start to gain less extrinsic value. So for whatever reason, the earning potential goes down because the sponsors aren't really interested in the competitive piano playing world anymore. It's now really about competitive saxophone. You will find quite often that person's motivation to do the thing that they absolutely loved initially will go net down. They will do less of this thing because you've replaced their motivation from an intrinsic one to an extrinsic one, and then you've taken the motivation away. And if you make that switch, you've just got to be very aware of doing that. So practical terms, think about things like loyalty programs. If someone comes to you because they desperately get them stamps so they can get a free coffee, and you take the loyalty program away, you will notice a drop off in repeat customers for a while until they kind of flush out of your pipeline. That is replacement, and it is a real thing, and people often fail to acknowledge that. Now, the other thing that's really, really powerful when you're trying to balance intrinsic motivations, extrinsic, intrinsic motivations, is this. This is something I learned when I used to do a lot of developer relations. I was a community builder, and still am for my product. And this is one of the most powerful kind of hierarchy. I used dashes because I didn't have time to sketch out a triangle. The really powerful hierarchy of customer engagement, user engagement. And the idea is that if you want people to kind of be like absolute bare minimum engaged with you, like if you give them some things like here's a mug, here's a t-shirt, like the stuff you get at conferences, like yeah, it makes you kind of vaguely warm and fuzzy about a company, but or about them, about your product, but they're not going to stick around necessarily. Like they're not going to have a lot of brand loyalty to you, or loyalty to your product. If you actually start to give someone, you know what? I believe I've got those two flipped around. If you start to give people early, no, I tell a lie. Sorry. So if you start to give people power in your product, so if you start to give them the ability to say, like, if you request a feature, we will actually, we will build that. and you get enough people requesting a feature, and lo and behold, you actually build the thing, people are going to they become emotionally invested with you because they now feel they have a stake in the thing that you are making. And then likewise, if you give them access to stuff that nobody else has access to, then they start to feel super special because now it's, they start to build that experience into, in some way, part of their identity. And then finally, there's status. There's this idea of like, you are basically holding up your customers, your users as icons of productivity, of being amazing at whatever it is that you're helping them do. Not great users, but great at whatever it is that you are helping them to achieve. A lot of photography products do this really well. So Nikon, for example, I know I've got a few friends who are part of a Nikon evangelist program, and they are held up as, they are phenomenal photographers, and they're not being held up as being great Nikon users. They happen to be great photographers. And so that association, that identity really builds it into their intrinsic motivations. Now, a really good way of, a good example that if you want to kind of explore this is Microsoft's MVP, Most Valuable Professional Program. Now, if you haven't heard of this, Microsoft has this thing where basically, if you contribute significantly to one of their technologies, so let's say SQL Server, this is what I used to be in, or SQL Server, they will potentially make you an MVP. And being an MVP for a given technology group with Microsoft gets you early access to all the stuff they release. It gets you, you actually get a suite of all their stuff, or some of those products. They'll send you a branded polo neck, maybe a hoodie, a mug. You get a little, what's the word? Like a trophy. And then they have the MVP Summit every year in Seattle, where everyone comes along and they get the inside scoop on what's coming up in Microsoft. And those MVPs obviously have access to the product team, so they can influence the direction the product might go with their opinions and their awareness of the community. And they are held up on the Microsoft website as being these exemplars of how, people who do great database administration in the case of SQL Server. What's really interesting though, is that depending on which technology group you're looking at in Microsoft, the prerequisites for being an MVP are very, very different because they're designing for different communities. They're designing for different experiences. But irrespective, this hierarchy of needs is proven one of the most powerful things I've used in my career when I'm trying to build a community of users, a community of product people, of passionate people around my brand, around a product. You just got to understand how to think about how to tune that. So that's kind of a slightly left field approach to gamification. This idea of don't try and just glue things together and hope they'll go faster or be better. Actually, go to the top and think about these ideas of depth and complexity, of how do we onboard, how do we think about the aesthetics and the features, and what are is people's motivation for doing this? Is it extrinsic or is it intrinsic? If you can think about just those four, and obviously there's more, and I can recommend you some really good resources to kind of explore that, you will end up with a much more powerful product at the end of it that has been effectively invisibly gamified. Made to be like a game in the sense that it really understands the users who are trying to play it. So that's kind of my gamification take. I'm going to pause there momentarily before I say anything else, but wait, there's more. I actually have another presentation where I'm actually going to talk about, it's a super quick one, talking about how I applied some of these principles to actually onboard a team very, very quickly and very, very effectively. So I'm going to pause there momentarily in case there are questions or observations.
So guys, if at this point you have any questions about what Chris has talked about, you can drop it on the Q&A section or the chat. We can always go on and then ask all questions at the end. But I'm gonna give it another 30 seconds or so.
Time starts now.
See if anyone is brave enough to start talking. But
I should point out, I am no expert.
On the note of gamification, I also highly recommend everyone to look up Yukai Chu's Octalysis framework. It focuses a lot on gamification for SaaS products, and he actually made the first bit of gamification for eBay, which was adding the time pressure for people to buy, and that's what made eBay popular. But he divides that into sort of what he calls white hat and black hat. So positive motivations and kind of the nasty one, so to speak. Like giving people 30 seconds to ask questions, and people are doing it. So what do you know?
Obviously for anyone who's not aware, like just a quick Google of dark patterns will give you a whole bunch of like really, really sneaky sort of psychological prints, like hacks, for want of a better word.
Psychological pressure, so to speak.
Well, yes, exactly. Psychological forces that can be applied to achieve what you want with people, perhaps not exactly against their will, but perhaps not necessarily in line with their desires. And that is, that is kind of gamification gone rogue, right? That is this thing where actually you're effectively manipulating behavier.
Yeah, it kind of leads into product ethics a little bit, which I think you, Todd, and I should sit down and talk about that someday. But we have a couple questions here.
Okay.
The first one is, how early should we think about gamification?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And honestly, my approach to that is to not think about gamification at all. Like, because it's like saying, that's like saying, how early should we think about our feature set? Well, when it's ready. You don't necessarily decouple thinking about feature set from thinking about the UI, for example. I think this is not intentionally a cop-out answer, but what I would say is, don't think about gamification as a distinct process, right? It's not about like, okay, we've made the product. Now, how do we make it nice? How do we make people want to do it? Like, that's not the way to approach the problem. The thing to do is actually start with, and this is, it's kind of baked into how you could do product management, right? Where you say, well, who are our users? Like, what's the persona we're trying to build for? What problem are we trying to solve? And what are we trying to communicate to them with the product? Like, what experience are we trying to create? Do we want them to have to spend some time mastering the product? Does it need to be very complex? Does it need to be very fine-grained? Do we want it to feel friendly? Do we want it to feel professional? Like, those kinds of questions that you're asking at the level of what features do we represent to, what features do we present to the user and when, and how do we, like, what kind of design palette do we use, design system? So I think asking the question of when do you think about gamification, you're potentially setting yourself up for trouble, because then depending on who you ask, people are gonna start saying, oh yeah, we should totally like reward people for doing stuff, and start thinking people tend to fall into the habits of points and badges and leaderboards and rewards, and that's a slippery slope. If you feel that you need to reward people for doing a certain thing in your product, that should be part of the experience, not something that is kind of added after you've designed the rest of the features. If you want a really good example of this, take a look at Stack Overflow. Like, Stack Overflow is not necessarily, it is probably one of the best examples I've seen of gamification applied to product in a way that achieves the goals of the creators. Now, it is not without its faults, do not get me wrong, but the point is, they intrinsically reward you for doing the things that they want people to do on the platform, but also that users want to do on the platform. So the more you engage with it, the more power you get on the platform to start, moderating and things like that. And the more status you get. Like, they've really thought through that kind of the anthropology of their user base and what they want to achieve. And they've thought about, how do we make this, how do we gamify this? Although I'd be surprised if they actually use that terminology internally. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Like, I would say the one answer is think about gamification at the start, and the other answer is don't think about gamification at all. Think about that experience you want to create, and what's the story almost you want to tell with your product to the user.
And that leads really well into the next question, which is examples of gamification in SaaS services. So yeah, Stack Overflow is one. Remember, one thing that I think is important is gamification is a really big umbrella, and it's not just badges and leaderboards. And people tend to think of gamification as just that.
Exactly.
But gamification is everything from personalization. So give someone the opportunity to put in their profile picture and enter a name.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually gamification, because you're giving the person ownership over something. It's
You're giving them an
theirs.
identity.
You're giving them an identity, right? Exactly.
There was if you want a really great little, the other thing to bear in mind is that I've seen some great examples of what you might call humanizing design, which is a kind of gamification because it delights me and it gives me a sense of the identity of the product, and it makes me want to come back and use it. So a great example of this is what's called Ethnio. It's ETHN.io. They're a research screening product they do pop-ups on your website that you can use to screen potential user testers. And it's okay, but what's really fun about it is the login screen. Every time you refresh it, there's a kind of slightly different message on there that kind of speaks to who the creators are. I literally spent there like refreshing the page 5 times and having a little giggle every time I do it, because they've got a lot of great flavor text in there that makes me feel a little bit delighted to use their product. The Slack messages that pop up when you when you fire up Slack, that's a similar example of just a little bit of delight to kind of like keep you feeling engaged with the product and kind of give you a sense of what their values are, the narrative they're trying to tell with the product.
Absolutely. And again, if you guys want to check out Yukai Chu's Octalysis framework, it's actually a lot about human-centered design and gamification. And it talks a lot about these positive motivations and I don't want to call them negative, but what he calls black hats. So things like, I'm sure at least 99% of you have looked at Candy Crush. And that sense of, oh my God, I'm running out of time. That is a type of gamification. It's the sense that you're going to miss out on something and you have to, either purchase a life or, do you really want to wait another 30 minutes for your next life? So
I mean, that's an interesting look. That's interesting because that's literally a game, and what they've done there is that they've found all those
gamified their game. That's a whole other like made up, right? They have
mind blown.
Absolutely. I do know that you want to go through your MTPCON slides, so maybe we can do that really quickly.
Sure. I'll shoot through that. Let me just okay. So what I'm going to do, cancel out that. So this is your 2-for-1, folks. Like this is basically this came up in the conversation with Andrea when we first talked about this, and I was looking at sort of the experience of onboarding people really quickly, because this obviously the onboarding hook is there, right? And I started thinking about so I build the volunteer crew for all of our conferences at Mind the Product. So every MTPCON, so we've got one coming in San Francisco soon. There's going to be like 1,600 people there. The ProdPad crew are going to be there. It's going to be amazing. You should come. But the point is, I build a crew of about 30 people who have never met each other beforehand, and I get them on board, or I get them enthusiastic, I get them aligned, and we have a great day. And that's a really interesting challenge. And I realized the more I thought that when I was looking into this, that I'm actually using some of these principles to actually achieve that. So let me quickly run through like what I mean by sort of building a team in less than a day kind of thing. So the first question I had to ask myself was, okay, what problem am I trying to solve? And I'm kind of like, I'm a product person kind of trying to run an event here. And so my first goal is attend to delight. I want the people who come to the event to feel positive. I want them to feel sort of appreciated. They have a premium experience, like they want to have a good time and get value. I also want to do that. I need to get my crew onboarded and kind of aligned with me as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. Now, you can use well, I'm just going to run through this very quickly. It's largely photos just to kind of illustrate my points. The thing to bear in mind is that you could use this with any team that you wanted to onboard quickly, and you could also apply it to users if you kind of abstract a little bit. But this is particularly useful if you want to kind of gamify the onboarding of people onto your teams. So I'm going to sort of anchor this in the talk I've just done. So first things first, like using aesthetics to communicate. So when people show up to the event, I have a lot of volunteers who are doing registration. And so this is looking at it from the attendees perspective. You can automate check-in, like you can have machines where you basically scan your badge and you get checked in, whatever. But we made the conscious decision to actually have human beings involved. So talking about this kind of like gamifying the experience, this is an example from our San Francisco event, and like in probably good-looking human beings aside, like they are human faces, they are positive, they're smiling. That's your first point of contact with the event. This is your onboarding experience, right? And so people are going to walk out of that feeling that little bit more positive. This is from the London event. So, that's kind of a good example of the bird's eye view. We make a very strong point that when we actually build the crew, we do sort of build a diverse crew so that actually there's a lot of, it's a really welcoming space that people feel represented by. And then like people's engagement is positive. When we onboard, when we welcome people, there's a lot of eye contact. It's a very personal conversation. It's their first experience of the event. And that's really important. And I kind of work hard to instill that in the crew when we're kind of talking to them, and sort of, this is like, you grab your bag and then you're into the event. And like, this has been your journey into like this like the morning of the conference. And that's kind of a really important thing from the attendees' point of view, is creating this aesthetic that communicates the intent, communicates the narrative of the event. Now, going back to the crew side, like how do I bring these people together really, really quickly and really, really effectively? It's these two forces, right? It's the onboarding of the crew, and it's the depth and complexity. Now, strap in, I'm going to show you a spreadsheet real quick. This is the rota that we use to actually figure out who's doing what throughout the day. And it looks complicated, but you'll see that most people are actually only doing one, maybe two things that actually are significant. We used to actually rotate people through lots of different tasks because we didn't want them to get bored. So I was like, okay, you'll do this for half an hour, and then this for an hour, and then this, and it was, that meant that everyone had to be onboarded to every single function, and it meant that the crew was having to think through new stuff every hour, and it was massively chaotic for them and massively difficult in the briefing at the start of the day. So actually, we simplified it right down and said, okay, you are going to be the speaker care crew or the sponsor care crew, and you'll do one or two other things, but like you are already focused now, which means that each of these teams of people can have their own dedicated, in-depth onboarding conversation with the team lead, and everyone feels really empowered to understand exactly what is needed for them for the specific functions they're doing. And it all starts in the morning where we do a full-on kind of onboarding where I'll kind of like do a welcome and talk through. So most of these people won't have met me before this day, or indeed have met each other. And there's a couple of things that are really important to note here. So first of all, it's kind of like food brings people together. Like if you want to onboard a crew really quickly, like give them food. Like we make sure they've got coffee, they've got breakfast, and kind of like we make them feel welcome like that. I make a point of actually their crew t-shirt and their badge and their booklet is actually waiting for them in a neat pile when they get there. So they feel appreciated. We've taken the time to actually like make their experience when they first start as smooth as possible. You'll see a couple of people have got these little booklets as well. So in terms of onboarding, like we condense all the core details of the day to like the simplest like handbook that makes them empowered throughout the day. So again, we're trying to make sure that they are getting exactly what they need when they need it. And that is the back of my head with blue stripes. That is absolutely accurate. And to the point of aesthetics, I feel like that kind of communicates a certain thing to the team as well as to the attendees that, well, basically I'm a bit mad, but there's a certain amount of lightheartedness to it and a certain amount of fun to it. I think that's a really important thing when bringing a team together quickly like this, in this kind of context. It doesn't work in every context, obviously, but it does work here. And the other thing is, when I was speaking about food, like I make sure I bake for the team whenever I can. Andrea's had some of my cookies.
His cookies are fantastic.
Yeah, but food brings people together really, really quickly. And I think it's a really important force. Now, the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is kind of the extrinsic, intrinsic motivation. So I know I've been talking about this from a conference crew perspective, but this is true of bringing any community together. So if you wanted to bring together a community of users really, really quickly, you need to think about, the aesthetics of what you're doing. When I say aesthetics, I mean like the language you use in your emails. I mean like a profile picture that you use on a, if you're having a little like pop-up community forum, like a meetup, like these things all matter. They tell people something about what you're asking of them, what to expect. And so the thing to bear in mind here is that for us, when we bring the crew together, like the crew is made up entirely of people who are already product people. They get value from being a part of this event. And because of that, that makes it really, really easy to speak to them about the things that matter to them. I'm not just getting random people who are vaguely interested. These are people who want to be a part of the community, and you find people like that everywhere. So if you need to build a team, that's really important, and it's crucial to understand what is driving them. So this is the merry band of maniacs that I bring together, once in about a day, and that's kind of it's a slightly orthogonal thing, but I think it's a really nice illustration of how you can use like the principles that I talked about in terms of thinking about the journey and the narrative you want to create and bringing that together to actually create an experience that gets people to where they need to be as quickly as possible. And I'm not going to show that video because we don't have time. So I'm going to close that there. So yeah, that's kind of a neat little practical example of, at least I think, of how, you know, you can apply this stuff to both practical examples, but also building communities really, really quickly.
Cool, thank you, Chris. We have 2 questions, and I know that you have a hard stop at 5, so we'll try to answer them in exactly 9 minutes. So there's more gamification for you. The first is, how important is reviewing user experience to ensure it's built in and not bolted on? And do you have any tips to ensure that process is successful in making the product something that creates superpower for users rather than just a good product? So Sam, that's a great question. It's like super complicated. I don't know if we can answer in 9 minutes, but
I've got an answer for you right away, actually. And it's basically go and check out Kathy Sierra. So you want to, hang on, let me just scroll down, like, go and check this out. Making users awesome. Like, this is basically the answer to your question about how do you, the answer to your question is that, like, you're trying to understand what problem is your user trying to solve. And if you can, like, understand, like, and it's not, and I'm using like a lot there, it's not about just what problem are they trying to solve in the abstract. It's about who are they trying to be? Like, what narrative are they trying to tell about themselves? That's the thing to focus on. If you can understand that, then you can actually hang everything off that and understand what's the user experience they need to create to create that quote unquote badass user. That book is super, super short. I think I've got a copy right here. It's literally like half a centimeter thick. That video is free on mindtheproduct.com. Go and watch it. She talks about cameras as a great example, buying a camera and then using a camera, are very different experiences. Go there.
Thank you, Sam. I hope that somehow answers your question. The next question is, do you have any examples of gamification in marketing and how to influence purchase decisions? Whoa. So I'm going to say, I'm going to say, well, if you like, ping that to me on Twitter. Like, I'm happy to, I'm happy to have this conversation on Twitter after. So, like, you know, my Twitter handle is @Massey. So, like, that could be that's a really interesting conversation. And if you have an answer right away, Andrea, go for it. But for me, I need to think. Yeah, I mean, I would say understanding the purchase decision first. So one thing that we've done at ProdPad is if you go to ProdPad.com, you'll get a little bot that first asks you what your role is. And then depending on your answer, we'll then ask you more questions. And then depending on that answer, we will guide you through a bit of a particular funnel to talk to us or to provide you
all the way down.
Right. But it is really fun because it kind of starts pinging, okay, so are you a product manager? Are you looking for roadmaps? Great, check this out. And so it's kind of fun. And, you know, I think it's fun, but I think it's kind of fun. But it also allows us to understand who our target audience is or who is coming to our website so that then we can start funneling that person towards what they need. So I think gamification marketing is, or at least in sales, to influence a purchasing decision is a little bit tricky because, at least for a tool like ProdPad, while our target audience might be product managers, we also have customer service team, customer success teams, we have C-level executives, we have like all these teams or all these different buying personas that may be interested in us, as with any product. And so, you know, I think it's about understanding your user personas first, as opposed to just trying to add gamification without purpose. I don't know if that makes sense.
I would also add one more thing, which is like, think about the depth and complexity issue, right? Which is that, and so the line between, you know, gamification, sort of pricing strategy and product psychology, like, it's super murky at this point. Like, this is one of the things with gamification. We're trying to break it out as its own thing is not necessarily helpful. It's just a different kind of design problem, effectively. And so in this case, one thing to consider is look at the way that, look at the depth and complexity of your pricing, for example, of your pricing and purchasing workflow. Like, for example, does your user want to have fine-grained control of exactly every add-on, every bundle, every, like, the pricing window? Do they need to see, like, all the details of what they're getting and there's a lot of complexity there, and some people really want that complexity. Some people really want to have that really fine-grained control. Some people just say, like, I have a problem right now, button, done, thank you, let me get on with my life, because they want to go and like they want to take the thing and go and figure it out. Now, arguably that's a UX and pricing strategy problem, quite possibly, but you could also treat it as a gamification problem in the sense that helping people like find the best deal. People really like getting deals. So you could actually make that kind of experience of getting the best value they possibly can, like figuring out how to get the best value. You could almost make that part of the experience, and people tend to look at pricing matrices or feature matrices for that purpose. So arguably there's a depth and complexity way of looking at that. That's what just came to mind right now. But I'll have a think, and if I think of any great ideas, I will let you know.
Cool. So guys, we will be sending out the recording, so you can watch this again. We will also be sending you Chris's Twitter, so you can reach out to him at any time. But thank you everyone for attending today. Thanks, Chris. This was awesome. Maybe we'll do a follow-up next year, talk a little bit more. But this was a lot of fun, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good one.
Thank you.